to welcome you and thank you for coming to the kickoff of the 2014-15 Richard McCarthy Lecture Series. I would like to start by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Heather Sturr. I'm one of the faculty fellows in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society, and I'm a professor in the history department. And I am also the coordinator of this year's McCarthy Lecture Series. As many of you know, the lecture series is an event that we've been able to hold every year for, I think, 10 years at this point. Yeah, 10 years, due to the generous and ongoing support of Dr. Craig Howard, who is here with us today, and Dr. Richard McCarthy, who is unable to be with us today. But I want to thank Dr. Howard and Dr. McCarthy for their continued support of the Dale Center and of our programs. The lecture series... The lecture series is one of our most important forms of community outreach because it allows us to bring in leading scholars who are studying various topics related to war and society, not only to the Southern Miss community, our students and our faculty, but also to the greater Hattiesburg community. So again, I want to thank Dr. Howard and Dr. McCarthy for allowing us to continue this important outreach program that we've been doing. Before I introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, I want to take a minute to recognize 3 Dale Center graduate students who are the inaugural recipients of our Colonel Wade Benson Fellowships for graduate students who are doing work on war and society topics. The Benson Fellowships were made possible by another one of our important and longtime supporters of the Dale Center, Colonel Wade Benson, who is here with us. Thank you for Colonel Benson is a retired Marine Corps colonel and also an alum of Southern Miss, where he got a bachelor's degree in mathematics. And so we are very grateful to Colonel Benson for his support, not only of the Dale Center, but particularly of our graduate students and their work. I just want to mention a little bit about the 3 Benson Fellows this year. We have 2 of them here so we can recognize them. Alan Brandstetter is a Ph.D. student who is working on a dissertation looking at Mississippi politics during Reconstruction and examining the role of individuals and local politics in the process of winning the peace after the U.S. Civil War. Alan was able to use his Benson Fellowship to make several research trips throughout Mississippi and also to make research trips and go to conferences in Baltimore and Northampton, Massachusetts, because as it turns out, Yankees were quite prominent in Reconstruction politics in Mississippi, for better or for worse. And so Alan has been able to further his research because of his Benson Fellowship. So Alan is here with us. Jason Engel, also a PhD student. He's not here with us because he's out of town working on his dissertation. But Jason is doing a dissertation on Austrian soldiers in the First World War. And thanks to his Benson Fellowship, he was able to spend 7 weeks in Innsbruck, Austria, doing archival research for his project. So he also is very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do overseas research, which, as we all know, is expensive, and particularly on a graduate student budget. So Jason's very thankful to Colonel Benson. And then thirdly, Jonathan Harton, who is a PhD student who's working on a dissertation looking at how communities and individuals in early North America responded to conflict. And he's going to use his Benson Fellowship to do archival research in Winston-Salem, looking at the relationship between revolutionary Whig militias and Moravian settlers. So Jonathan is here as well. So again, thank you, Colonel Benson, for your support of our graduate students. And they're really important and fascinating projects. Now, to the purpose of the evening, which again is to kick off our 2014-15 McCarthy Lecture Series. The speakers in this year's series will all elaborate on the topic, the media in the military, or as we're calling this series, Embedded, War and the Fourth Estate. So all of our speakers are going to elaborate on the relationship between media and the military. And we'll have talks that look at topics from reporting the Vietnam War, which is the subject of tonight's talk, to a talk next week, which I hope you all can join us for, Monday, September 29th, here in LAB 101 at 6 p.m. General Buford Blunt will talk about his experience with Ted Koppel, who was embedded with him and the 3rd Infantry Division in Baghdad in 2003. And then yours truly will wrap up the series on October 6th with a talk about Dickie Chappelle, who was a war correspondent covering Iwo Jima. She covered the Algerian War for Independence, and she was killed early on in Vietnam in 1965. So a variety of different approaches to the theme of the media and the military. This is an important subject when we think about war in society, because the media is one of the primary, if not the primary way that the citizens on the home front learn about what's going on in a war. For those of us who aren't fighting, who don't have loved ones who are fighting, the media informs us on what's going on. And in this day and age of the 24-hour news cycle and the kind of immediacy of news, the embedded reporters that are going out with American troops in places where the U.S. is fighting wars or has troops stationed, the relationship between the media and the public's understanding of war will only continue to be important. And so the topics that our speakers will elaborate on during this series will not only give us some historical context, but will also provide ways in which we can think about our current conflicts and the relationship between the media and the military. And so I am very pleased to announce our leadoff speaker, introduce our leadoff speaker tonight, Dr. Dan Hallin, who is a professor of communication at the University of California, San Diego. The title of his talk is Reporting the Vietnam War. Dr. Hallin's research concerns journalism, political communication, and the comparative analysis of media systems. He is the author or co-author of numerous books and articles, also book chapters, and he's written extensively on the media and war, including the conflict in Vietnam, conflicts in Central America, and also the Gulf War. He focuses on comparative analysis of media systems, particularly looking at the US, Latin America, and Western Europe. His book, Comparing Media Systems, 3 Models of Media and Politics, co-authored with Paolo Mancini, has won the Outstanding Book Awards of the International Communication and National Communication Associations and the Goldsmith Book Award of the Shorenstein Center on Press and Politics at Harvard. It has also been translated into 9 languages. Most recently, Dr. Hallin is finishing up a book that he's co-authoring with a colleague, Charles Briggs, from UC Berkeley's Anthropology Department, on the U.S. media's reporting on healthcare and health crises. And one of the things that Dr. Hallin mentioned to a number of us in some casual conversations today was the parallels that he discovered looking at how the U.S. media has covered health crises compared to how the U.S. media has covered wars, looking at both of them as issues of national security, which is fascinating. And I don't know that that will come up in Dr. Hallin's talk, but perhaps if that's something of interest to you, maybe we could bring up in the Q&A. But a really interesting parallel that Dr. Hallin has discovered in his research. So please join me in giving Dr. Hallin a warm welcome to our campus.
So thank you, Dr. Stir. I'm honored to be here at the Dale Center and really impressed with the turnout for this talk tonight. So I'm going to talk first of all about the media in Vietnam and the argument that I make in my book, The Uncensored War, that in quotation marks the media and Vietnam. Then I'm going to say a little bit about what has and hasn't changed since Vietnam, focusing primarily on the Iraq War. I'm going to try and keep it relatively brief so that you can ask questions and we can get some discussion going, but of course you know that that's kind of famous last words for a professor. So. There's a very strong conventional wisdom about the role of media in the history of the Vietnam War. It's a conventional wisdom that portrays the media as decisive actors. And the conventional wisdom basically says that the media played a central role for better or for worse, in turning the American public against the Vietnam War, and in that sense was central to its outcome. There's a particular corollary to that conventional wisdom that's very important that focuses on television. So this was the first televised war. There was television at the time of Korea, but television wasn't the phenomenon that it was. It was in 1964 for the first time that a majority of the public said that they got their news mainly from television. It was in 1963 that the half-hour evening news, as we know it, debuted. So it was the first television war. And the argument has frequently been made that because people saw the true horror of war night after night on their television screens, this was what turned the public against the Vietnam War. One of the things that's really interesting about this conventional wisdom is that it's been shared across the political spectrum and across the political divisions over the Vietnam War. So there's a quote-unquote conservative version of it, that is to say, a version held by those who are supporters of the Vietnam War, according to which the media were the villains of the Vietnam War. They turned the public against the war that the United States could have won and should have won if it had been willing to stay the course. And in that sense, they were the villains. And then there's a liberal version of it, or a version that's held to by opponents of the Vietnam War. And this is also the version that most journalists would hold to, according to which the media were the heroes of the Vietnam War. They told the public the real truth about Vietnam that the government was trying to cover up, and made it possible for the nation to make a rational decision to get out of the Vietnam War. I argue in my book that that conventional wisdom is wrong, that the media were more followers than they were leaders in the change of opinion and policy on the Vietnam War. In the early days of the Vietnam War, by which I mean basically pre-Tet Offensive, before, and also importantly before the election of 1968, what I argue is that media coverage of the Vietnam War followed the very traditional kind of deference to government elites and rallying around the flag that is a pattern that was set essentially in World War II and carried over into the Cold War and persisted through the Vietnam War. The journalists were generally deferential in terms of the political rationale for the war, deferential to government officials in the sense that they interpreted the war politically as a front essentially in the Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, and for that reason decisive to American security, and believed that it was necessary for the United States to intervene. They were generally also accepting of military claims of victory and progress. So the typical television news broadcast, the anchor would go through and he would show you a map of Vietnam and, you know, with arrows and so on, and he would talk about a great victory here and a big victory there and the progress that was being made. This was the staple of the news. This came from the daily press briefing in Saigon. Journalists, that was really the core of front page news coverage from Vietnam. The main focus of news coverage from the front end, particularly of the so-called living room war, of television coverage, was American boys in action, and that coverage was very supportive, not surprisingly. Right. So the focus was on the professionalism, the bravery of American soldiers, and in many ways the main thing that the journalists did in covering the war was to kind of cement the bonds of sentiment between the mass public at home and the soldiers that were in the field, who people had contact with through the media. And finally, the coverage was quite sanitized. So although when we watch documentaries about the Vietnam War, we see a lot of graphic footage of the violence of war. That is not what appeared on television screens night after night. There were a few occasions, particularly during the Tet Offensive in 1968 and subsequent years, when graphic violence did appear on the television screen, but that was quite rare, actually. Journalists wanted to get bang-bang footage whenever they could, but a lot of the time they couldn't, and even when they did get the bang-bang footage, if they had footage of graphic footage of casualties, for example, for the most part it ended up on the cutting room floor. Sometimes we see it in those documentaries, but we didn't see it on the evening news during the Vietnam War. Now I want to pause here, and if I can make the technology work, I'll show you a couple of television stories from the early period of the Vietnam War, 1965, 1966, when the big buildup of American troops was first going on. I always have great trepidation about whether the technology will work, but here we go, we'll see. Audio. The audio plug is in. This isn't going to work. This often happens. Let me tell you a little bit of what you're seeing here is just an interview with a bunch of soldiers. I'm going to pull out the audio plug to that. So the journalist is interviewing a bunch of soldiers who are wounded in a battle, and they're just telling about their experiences. It's kind of, Ernie Pyle, day-to-day life of the soldiers. Ernie Pyle, famous correspondent from World War II who focused on the everyday lives of the soldiers. A lot of them are talking about how they're hurt for the moment, but they want to get back into the fight. And then their officer comes, their commander comes, and he talks about what great men they are and how they're ready to get back in the fight. He also has been wounded, and that's pretty typical. The next story that I was going to show you was a story about a rescue mission where there's an orphanage, a Catholic orphanage that's threatened by Viet Cong. The troops go in helicopters and they pull people out of the orphanage. And you hear the leader of the orphanage, he says that he says, well, we were through he doesn't actually speak, but he says through the journalist, we were threatened here. And then there's a very interesting little commentary that Chet Huntley, the anchor, makes after that. He says something like, well, we show stories like this from time to time, not to show what great guys Americans are, but to show what men are and what war is. And I don't know, it goes on a little bit after that. It's a very interesting conclusion because I think it reflects the kind of ambivalence that journalists were beginning to feel around this time, which is kind of inherent to the coverage of war. That is, that journalists are supposed to be neutral observers. They're supposed to be watchdogs of those in power. They're not supposed to be cheerleaders. They're not supposed to be on one side or another. They're supposed to stand back and report the facts. But in time of war, we expect something different of them. We expect them to be on the team, as journalists were in World War II, to be patriots, to be celebrating American soldiers at war. That's what they were doing, but they were feeling nervous about it because this was the beginning of 1966. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee was holding hearings. It was the first time there was any real debate about Vietnam. People were beginning to ask questions, and so the journalists were beginning to talk among themselves. Should we use first-person plural? Should we talk about our troops, or should we not? Because Journalists aren't supposed to say we in that way. So you're beginning to get the first inklings of changes that would come later on. But the early coverage was generally very supportive, sanitized, very little critical reporting. So you could say that in this early period, the news media played a role of rallying public support to the Vietnam War. After great skepticism, before Johnson made the decision to enter Vietnam in a big way, the public had to be rallied, and the news media played that role of helping to rally them. Now, later on, the news coverage did change in many ways. You didn't have these claims of victory with every story. The journalists began to become skeptical of that. That just kind of dropped out of the anchors reporting. And instead, you had a lot of emphasis on the kind of eternal recurrence of war. So, you know, a typical story, they would be an operation, and you'd hear the men talk about, this is what we did, this is what we accomplished, and the journalist will say, well, yeah, they've been in, over the years, they've been into this area over and over again, and everybody kind of knows that next year we'll be back here in the same way. So none of this claim of progress, we're surely going to win the war within a year. There was more focus on political discussion at home. And more focus on casualties. So, for example, when they gave the weekly body count figures, rather than putting them like a score by the flags, the journalists would sometimes apologize for the coldness of the numbers, and then they would use still photographs of dead or wounded soldiers. So it just became more sober in the later period. So you could say, well, maybe then that change in the tone of the news media was what turned the public against the war, although the truth is a lot of that coverage is not so dramatic if you look back at it. You think, well, it probably wasn't such a powerful influence. The other thing, though, is that the timing of the change just isn't right to make the case that it was the change in news coverage that changed public opinion. So this is where I argue that the media were more followers than they were leaders in the opinion, in the change of policy and opinion on the Vietnam War. And what did they follow? Well, they followed public opinion itself, I would say. News media are attuned to public opinion. The trend in public opinion is that there was basically a big rallying when Lyndon Johnson first sent large numbers of troops to Vietnam in 1965, so support for the war peaked at the beginning of 1966, right about the time of that story that I was going to show it, I guess you didn't see it, and then it went basically in a straight line with hardly any bends in the curve. It just went down until the end of the war. A majority by the spring of 1967, a majority of people disapproved of the president's handling of the war, and then by the fall of 1967, a majority of the public believed that it had been a quote-unquote mistake to get into the Vietnam War. So that's the best time series we have on public opinion. The main changes in the media, and particularly in television, media are complex, of course, different media change at different times, but particularly in television, occurred in the period in 1968 and after 1968. So the majority of the public had already turned against the Vietnam War before the tone of the news coverage began to change. So media followed public opinion. They followed their elite sources in Washington as well. So by the time you had this change, you had already had two secretaries of defense, McNamara and Clifford, who had come to the conclusion that the Vietnam War could not be won at reasonable cost. This effect, and of course there were many lower level people at various parts in the national security bureaucracy who had been discussing the Vietnam War for quite a while by this time. These are the people that the journalists in Washington are in contact with, and they have a lot of impact on the news media. There's a whole theory in the field of political communication about the way that media follow elite debate, something we might come back to discussing later on. But as political elites became increasingly divided about the war, the media began to treat it differently, right? Not as a sacred national cause, but as a political issue. And that changed the tone. And of course, the election of 1968 was very important in this respect. When Lyndon Johnson announces that we're going to try and find our way out of Vietnam, when Richard Nixon runs as the candidate who's going to get us out of the war in Vietnam, that obviously changes the tone of the news coverage. Finally, the media followed the morale of American troops in the field. So, especially for television and to some extent for newspapers, the main characters are, of course, the American soldiers in Vietnam. In the early days, the morale of American troops was very good, and that was strongly reflected in the news coverage, as you would have seen, if you saw the videos there. Later on, there was a major collapse of morale among American troops in Vietnam. This was the period when you had draftees who were afraid of being the last casualty in a war to which the nation was no longer committed. And in that context, when journalists interviewed soldiers in Vietnam, there were a lot of them who would say, not, I want to get back into the fight, but I just want to go home. I'm hoping that they're going to call the number of my unit and I can go home. This is 1969, maybe beginning of 1970, or by 1971, 1972, you're having a lot of them who are going to say this is a useless war. We don't see any point in being here. And that, again, is reflected in the tone of television coverage. Here I want to make a larger point, and then I'll move on in a moment to talk about changes, and that is that, so if you ask why did public opinion change on the Vietnam War, I would say, first of all, because it went on so long, right? I mean, the first American was killed in 1961, the last in 1975. That's 3 times as long as World War II. There were 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. If you can imagine that in the contemporary context, right? I mean, that's a lot of casualties. Americans were very skeptical about whether we should get into the Vietnam War. They supported it as long as they thought it wasn't going to be too long and too costly. But as it went on and more people began to see, yes, it was going to be a long and costly war, it seems to me that it's not surprising that people began to turn against it, and they probably would have, regardless of how the media particularly framed it. The other, perhaps deeper thing that I would say is that our culture of war that mobilizes public support for a war is based on the idea of total war as we knew it in World War II, right? It's based on a war in which the national existence is at stake, and we think of the war as being a sacred cause to which we dedicate everything, essentially. And the media, of course, has a big role, not only in news, but in other, other kinds of representation of war, in cementing that understanding of war. But since the end of World War II, we don't fight total wars anymore, right? In the nuclear age, we don't fight total wars. Our wars are limited wars. They are, as Clausewitz said, an extension of politics by other means. They're not a sacred cause. They're an instrument to accomplish some political end. And when politicians decide that they're not accomplishing that end at reasonable cost, well, they say, okay, let's try a different policy. Let's get out of this war. But that's very hard for the public to accept. It's hard for soldiers to accept because it's not a limited war for them. And I think it's partly these contradictions of a war like the Vietnam War that are ultimately at the root of the decline of public support for the war. And again, you have to see the media coverage within that larger context rather than thinking of the media as the cause of these changes in public opinion. Now, let me switch. I'm happy to go back to anything you want to ask about Vietnam later on, but let me switch and say a little about what has and hasn't changed. I'll focus here on the Iraq War as I go on. I might fill in a few other things. When the Iraq War unfolded, my first reaction to it was that it seemed like an almost identical replay in many ways of the of the pattern of coverage on the Vietnam War. And I have to say it was very disheartening to me as somebody who has written about the media in Vietnam War and the Vietnam War, and among other things, tried to kind of educate journalists about don't make these mistakes again. think this thing through. Journalists were, of course, very deferential to official rationales, and the most dramatic symbol, of course, of this that we all have heard of, because the media made lots of apologies afterwards, was the acceptance of the claims about weapons of mass destruction that never turned out to be there, as well as the more general acceptance of the war against terror frame as the rationale, as the political context for understanding the beginning of the Iraq War. So the journalists were generally accepting of that. The coverage from the field once the war began was very much like early Vietnam coverage, all about the American boys in action and celebrating their professionalism, and also more and more we celebrate the technologies of war, right, and how effective they are. One bit of history to fit in here has to do with the embed program. So after the Vietnam War, the military accepted this conventional wisdom that media turned the public against the Vietnam War, and so with the Gulf War, the very restrictive policies were imposed on journalists covering the Gulf War, on the assumption that media coverage will turn people against the war, and so you want to keep them out. So censorship was reimposed. There was no censorship in the Vietnam War. If you want, we can go into that and why it wasn't and so on. Military security was protected by voluntary guidelines that journalists had to accept as a condition of being accredited to accompany military forces. But there was no censorship. Censorship was reimposed in the Gulf War, and probably more important, the journalists were assigned to pools. The military controlled their movement, and they were in general kept away from the fight. So most journalists who covered that war said, well, we missed it. We were just in the hotel, and maybe they let us take pictures of the planes taking off, but we missed it. But of course, the Gulf War played very well in the media, right? It was a short, successful war, and when you look back at it, it looked glorious and wonderful in the news. So after the Gulf War, the military kind of rediscovered that the media are not necessarily your enemy. The media can actually be very useful for building public support for a war. I once went to a conference where all of the public affairs officers for the different services who served during the Gulf War were there, and I remember the Army public affairs officer complaining that the Marines had stolen all the glory in the Gulf War because the Army commanders wouldn't let the journalists anywhere near their units, and the Marine commanders would, right? So they were talking about media as a force multiplier and so on. So they rediscovered what historians of media and war have long known, that media, their most basic role usually is this role I was talking about of cementing the bonds of sentiment between the mass public and the soldiers in the field, and that is a useful thing to the military. So in the case of the Iraq War, the restrictive policies were rescinded, journalists were embedded with military troops, which means they were assigned to frontline units. Lots of them were. They were given lots of accommodation, and they went out and covered the war, and it worked very well for the military in the sense that you got lots of first-hand, personalized coverage of the American troops with the accompanying emphasis on their professionalism and how impressive it is, how well they do their job. So you had this kind of very enthusiastic coverage in the beginning, and then you had the shift over to more sober and more skeptical coverage as things began to bog down and it became clear that things hadn't been thought through and that this was going to be a long war, and the timing was almost exactly the same as it was with the Vietnam War, with the inflection point again being the 2006 midterm elections, when the Iraq War became a major issue in American politics. So it's almost exactly the same pattern as you had in the Vietnam War in that sense. There were some important differences, though, and I want to talk about what some of them are. One of them that I think is partly important to understanding what's going on now with the debates about intervening again in Iraq is that dissent against war is now considered just a matter of course. So in the early days of the Vietnam War, protesters were treated as traitors, right? Communist sympathizers, absolutely not legitimate actors in American politics. Later on that changed, right, after 1968. But in the early days, they were absolutely excluded from the news agenda. Now it's taken for granted that, of course, we will have a debate whenever we go to war. So even in the case of the Gulf War, there was always coverage of the debate. It may not have been very extensive, but it was always there. And we're seeing a lot of it, actually, more than usual, in the current situation. Another difference, one of the things that really surprised me as I watched the coverage of the first Gulf War was that there was a tremendous amount of coverage of the home front. That was absolutely non-existent in coverage of the Vietnam War, and I think it reflects a big change in media agenda. So I'm thinking about all of the stories, particularly about the families at home, the communities, but above all, the families at home. You did not have that in the Vietnam War, not in national media. And I think it reflects a popularization of news, where news focuses much more on the ordinary person and how the ordinary person experiences events. And also, I would say, to some degree, on a kind of feminization of news and of American culture that resulted from the women's movement and other cultural changes of that sort. So, in 1965, if reporters had proposed to an editor, let's go out and do some story about the families at home, the editor would say, oh, this is war. This is about men. This isn't about women and children at home. Come on, what are you talking about? Today it's considered normal, right, to cover. We want to know how are the families at home experiencing this. And this is a pretty big change. Now, how does this affect the politics of the coverage or the way it presents war? Well, that's complicated, and it depends. So I would say in the early phase of a war, it reinforces this tendency to rally people around the troops. So this is the yellow flag phenomenon, right, from the first Gulf War. Everybody at home is putting yellow flags on their homes. We as a nation identify with the families, and the thing that we care about above all is the troops coming home safely. And one of the most important things that happened in the first Gulf War is that overnight, public support moved from 50-50 divided on fighting that war to 80-20 in favor. Is that because people changed their opinion about war as a political policy? No, it's because supporting the war means supporting the troops the day after the decision is actually made. And this is part of how that happens, right, is that we identify with the families, we identify with the troops, and the media play a really central role in that. Later on, though, as a war drags on, this focus on the families can turn around politically. So as the Iraq War went on, you had more and more stories that kind of personalized the costs of the war by looking at the families, the communities. Sometimes the families would not support the war, and that would become newsworthy. There was also a focus, one thing that goes along with this is a greater focus on the recovery of wounded vets at home, which was, again, absolutely never covered in the Vietnam War. It is part of this new kind of agenda. So it demonstrates the costs of the war in a way that you didn't see in earlier wars. Another important difference is partly indexed by the fact that in coverage of Vietnam, you almost never heard Vietnamese speak. So if you had seen what I was going to show you, this story about these Vietnamese refugees, they're being taken out, nobody's interviewing them, right? Nobody's asking them, what do you think about this? And that was typical. It was about American boys in action. If it was a story about Saigon politics, you have some politicians, but in general, Vietnamese did speak. If you look at coverage of the Iraq War, that's really not true. There are a lot of stories about what Iraqis think about the war, a lot of stories about Iraqi civilians, and many of them, don't express support for American policy in Iraq. You have quite a bit of diversity in opinions. That changes the tone a lot. Why that change? Well, I think that it has to do with the globalization of world media, which is symbolized, and the most important factor in this is global Arab media, particularly Al Jazeera, right? So there's a whole different representation of a war like this that's appearing on Arab media that focuses on those ordinary people, right? The Iraqi civilians, above all. That's the main focus of Al Jazeera's coverage. The world media know that, and they use that footage. German television had 40%, got 40% of its coverage from US and British media, 40% from Al Jazeera and other American media, right? So the world media system is much more multilateral than it once was. So world media use that material, and also, of course, policymakers are very well aware that in the Arab world, people are watching another representation, and it's a very strong concern of policymakers and top military commanders, and of course journalists know that. So this makes civilian attitudes different, and also civilian casualties much more newsworthy than they were in an earlier era. So you do definitely have more coverage of civilian casualties today than you did in the Vietnam War. What's my time like here? My watch is broken.
It's about 6:45.
Okay, so I should wrap up. And these are two really important changes. Let me just mention one other thing, and then I'm going to stop for questions. And that is, another thing that's changed is that media technology makes it much harder for the military to control the circulation of images. And I'm particularly thinking, there are many things I could mention here, but I'm particularly thinking of the combination of the internet and cell phone videos, right, or other kinds of digital recording devices. So again, there are a lot more images of civilian casualties circulate because civilians can make them themselves, right, and put them up on YouTube or send them to the world media. You don't have to have a journalist there for it to become news. And then, of course, think of this as another example of it. The biggest scandal of American involvement in the Iraq War, Abu Ghraib, that never would have been a story without the images. And who made the images? It was the American soldiers themselves with their digital cameras, right? And this is a change in the way that images are created that makes it much more difficult to control the flow of information. Okay, let me stop there and take your questions. Yes?
Walter Cronkite came on television one night. If I'm not mistaken, he had just been to Vietnam.
Right.
And he started questioning at that point.
Right.
For the first time, I think, any major network news person. Johnson supposedly said, immediately after watching Walter Cronkite, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the nation.
That's right. That's a true story. But I think that one shouldn't deduce from that it was Cronkite's statement that actually changed public opinion. I think Cronkite's statement was to Johnson a symbol of the fact that public opinion had changed.
Do you think that's an example of media following public opinion?
Well, yes, but here I should add a qualification to that is I'm not saying that media don't play any role in the change of opinion and policy, right? I think media follow public opinion, and in turn, of course, they affect it. And it's part of a snowballing process. So I'm sure that there were Americans who saw Walter Cronkite's broadcast, or even just, I think one of the most dramatic things about that, Cronkite reported from Vietnam before he made that broadcast. In those days, anchors didn't report from the field, right? You never saw their legs. They were always behind the podium in the newsroom. It was very dramatic, the fact that he went to Vietnam. People remembered him from World War II, right? He was a UPI reporter in World War II. And the fact that here was Uncle Walter wearing a steel helmet, crouching down in the field, which he often did, that was dramatic, and it dramatized what people were more and more beginning to see at that time, which is, wow, this war has really gotten big, much bigger than we were told it would get, much bigger than we imagined it would get. So, you know, I think that that's part of that whole process of change. But certainly, there's no evidence here that there's a sudden change in public opinion after Walter Cronkite spoke. To the extent that there is a change, there's some other data about whether people classify themselves as hawks and doves that show a change a little bit after that. That change is right after Lyndon Johnson made his speech, right, where he and, you know, the story of this is he changed the first line of his speech from, I want to talk to you about the war in Vietnam, to I want to talk to you about peace in Vietnam. And there does seem to be some evidence that of presidential leadership of public opinion. That is, that after he made that change, that speech, there were more people who said, yeah, I think we should get out of the Vietnam War. I would classify myself as a dove. That, I think, would be much more powerful than Cronkite's statement. But I think Cronkite certainly may have influenced Johnson, but remember again that 2 of his secretaries of defense had told him, you can't win this war, before Cronkite made that statement. So he had other influence on him as well. Some people tell the story as saying, well, this is what made Lyndon Johnson decide, you know, not to run and to change policy. But I think there was a lot more going on in the policy discussion. Yeah.
Is Al Jazeera so conservative that it's 180 beyond us? In other words, is that 100% the Arab?
No, I mean, Al Jazeera is, you know, all media are oriented toward their public. Al Jazeera's public is very diverse and complex, right? And like our diverse and complex public, Al Jazeera has to kind of find the center of it. Al Jazeera has a lot of pluralism in its coverage, which gets them in trouble because that's not, you know, that's not always the, well, it's certainly not the tradition in Arab media. The national Arab media don't have that kind of pluralism. And the pluralism definitely extends to interviewing American officials, American soldiers, Israeli officials, and so on, as well as, you know, both ISIS and the Arab governments who hate ISIS, and so it's quite pluralistic. Some people say that you could say, well, so you know, it's kind of like, let's say, Fox News in the sense that it has lots of bombastic opinion and then news broadcasts that are much more sober. I mean, it's kind of like American cable news in that sense. But it's not 180 degrees to the U.S., and it's pretty complex, actually. Yeah?
Yeah, in the 60s, the American public had much more trust in the media than they do today. I mean,
That's
Walter Cronkite, every word that came out of his mouth was gold. You could rely on it 100%. How do you see the public opinion of Vietnam, or do you even see a connection with the public opinion of what was going on in Nam during the 60s relating to that trust as compared to the almost total distrust of the media today?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that the media, people had much more trust in the media. And so that could mean that media had a lot more impact then. Although one phenomenon that some of the survey research shows is that people would, you know, people have selective perception, right? So people who were quote unquote hawks thought that Walter Cronkite was a hawk. And people who thought were doves thought he was a dove. So they would see in the news what reinforced their views, and they would even see in Walter Cronkite's reporting what reinforced their views. So that would diminish the impact of the media in that early period. Because remember, in that early period, the media were very straight, and they were very cautious, and they tried to be very neutral. And so that would diminish their impact. And particularly television, right? Television was a really cautious medium. Yes?
Yeah, just interested in your comment on TED offenses specifically in terms of effect on public opinion. There's been a lot of ink spilled on the thought that TED was actually a victory, that American media had a lot to do with the perception that it was not. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I have a whole discussion of that in
And I'm sure that's in your book.
I mean,
Ted wrote the book.
the first thing I would say is, if you look carefully at what the media said about it, they said exactly that it was a victory. Right? I mean, they accepted the military's interpretation that it was a victory. It is true that it didn't look like a victory, right? In the sense that that was the period when you saw heavy fighting. There were incidents like, the case of the one commander who said, we had to destroy the town in order to save it. Those became kind of iconic. It was very much a period when people saw different things in it, right? That is, Dove saw absolute disaster, and Hawk said, we've got to really go after them now. I do think that it really reinforced for people that this is a very big war. I remember having a conversation with one journalist this is Don Oberdorfer, who wrote a book about the Tet Offensive, and he was talking about Peter Brestrup, who wrote this other book about the Tet Offensive, who said, well, it was really a big victory and the media portrayed it as a defeat. And what Oberdorfer said, he covered it firsthand, he said, well, Brestrup was a really old-fashioned war correspondent. I was a political reporter above all, and to me it seemed obvious that politically this was not a victory. Politically, either for Lyndon Johnson at home or politically in terms of the course of the Vietnam War, politically in terms of Vietnamese politics. So, I think like any other event, it's very complicated to assess what was Tet, really. But the journalists, I would say, the journalists accepted the idea that it was a military victory. They said that. I think that it didn't look that way. And as it interacted with American politics, I think that it really, well, I think it really accelerated a process that was underway of people rethinking how long will this war
And I think much later, apparently, assessments seem to put more emphasis on it as a real turning point.
Yeah. Now, I would also say about Tet that in terms of the news coverage, what you see is that news coverage got really different during Tet, just partly in the sense that it was much more graphic, sometimes more critical, I would say, because there was this big emphasis on, oh, look at the incredible destruction that's going on here. Then it kind of went back to normal. And then it started changing again when, first of all, Richard Nixon made the decision to start withdrawing troops from Vietnam. And then secondly, a whole series of conflicts erupted in the Nixon administration about Vietnam policy. So there's a big split between the Defense Department and the State Department and Henry Kissinger in the White House and so on. And so there's a period after, so Tet played an important role, and then you have the election, and then things kind of go back to normal, and the president has a honeymoon, and then you have this really great intensification of the politics of the Vietnam War in the U.S., and of course then that's the period when the morale begins to collapse among American soldiers. So Tet is an important event in a lot of ways, and if you want to understand the change of opinion, change of media coverage, there's a whole longer series of events that goes on there. That, Tet's kind of in the center of it, but it's not the whole story.
And it's later on, I think it maybe took on more importance, in later coverage, nowadays, for instance, stories on the period, you're always emphasizing Tet.
Right. I mean, I'm not diminishing it in the sense, it was a big event at the time. It was a big news event. Walter Cronkite was there. It occurred right at the beginning of the 1968 election campaign, so I wouldn't really minimize it. But I'd also say you just have to see it in the context of this very powerful trend that had already gone a long way before it even happened. And this is public opinion, but similarly in terms of the policy discussion. So Tet comes after Robert McNamara had already advised Johnson, we crunched the numbers. You are not, this was a war of attrition, right? And so what the people in the Defense Department who were crunching the numbers said was basically, you are not keeping up with the North Vietnamese birth rate, right? You are not killing enough North Vietnamese that they would be unable to resupply their troops in the South. They can keep fighting this war for many years after that. And that, that made the policymakers think, well, this could go on for a long time. And Tet, even though it was militarily a victory for the United States, it didn't really change that. Right? I mean, the North Vietnamese lost a lot of people during Tet, but this basic reality that they could continue to fight the war for a long time was true. It also affected American politics a lot, the fact that Tet was followed by recommendations to increase the level of American troops. A lot of people said, well, it's such a big victory. Do we really have to increase the number of troops? That was the idea of increasing the number of troops when there are already 525,000 Americans in Vietnam. That was politically very charged at that moment. Yes.
Two comments here. Number one, it has to do with the comment that you just made about the Tet Offensive and all of that, and the fact that in reality, from a military perspective, quote unquote, it was a victory. I can't really speak to that from a media because I was there, and so I didn't have the opportunity to know what was going on in the media. But the point I would make about that is that in the talks in 1975 when the war went down, an American Army colonel was sitting at the table of the peace talks with a general from the North Vietnamese Army. And the Army colonel said words to the effect that, you never really defeated us in any of the battles. We won them all. And the North Vietnamese general, who was sitting there very calmly smoking his cigarette, and I'm sure you've heard this story, said words to the effect, that is true. He put his cigarette down and he said, that is also irrelevant. And that's the whole point that we missed. It's my point here. The media and everybody missed what was relevant, I think, and what defines victory or not in today's warfare, say, as opposed to World War II. And I would close with my second point here, that after I retired from the Marine Corps, shortly thereafter, it was 2003, when we went into Iraq, I was one of those talking heads that you saw on television as one of those quote-unquote experts, which I didn't really know anymore than anybody else did. But the point was, I worked with ABC News, and I covered the entire thing from Basra up through Baghdad, which was a fairly easy thing to do, because that was a military operation. And we went straight from Basra to Baghdad. And every day, 3 or 4 times a day, I was on news getting questions and talking about what had happened that day and getting to Baghdad. But that's not what I wanted to talk about, and that's what I tried not to talk about, because the point I kept making to the ABC News decision makers as to what goes on the air and what does not go on the air was it is irrelevant. We can go to Baghdad any day of the week. The issue is, what are we going to do when we get to Baghdad? And my point there is that the news media directors, the people who made the decisions of what was said and the questions that was asked and things like that on the news, totally and completely refused to address that issue. Because they did not understand. They thought it was just going to be like the Gulf War, we go to Baghdad and everything's over and everybody goes home. They failed to see what was really going to happen, and the fact that things didn't really start happening until after we took Baghdad. And my point there is just kind of like I think in Vietnam, that the news media didn't really know or understand what was going on either, and therefore some of the things that should have been reported were not reported.
Right, and this is exactly this point that I was making about the replaying of Vietnam that we had with Iraq. Yeah. How much time do you have left?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one thing you talked about. You talked about the colonels and generals telling Johnson that he couldn't keep up with the North Vietnamese birth rate. They dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than they dropped on Germany during World War II. And the second was, what was the effect of My Lai on the massacre on public opinion during the war?
One thing about the bombs, one interesting story that I was going to say, this is relevant to the thing about civilian casualties. You know, I think that one of the really interesting facts about the Vietnam War is that they didn't use B-52s in North Vietnam until, you know, the so-called Christmas bombing in 1972. Why? Because there were a lot of international reporters there, right? Japanese reporters, French reporters, and that would have looked really bad to be using strategic bombers over populated areas. They used it all the time in South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it caused a lot of civilian casualties there. In a lot of cases, that was the purpose of it, was to bomb the civilians out. But that was never a story on the news because there weren't any journalists there, right? And this is because it's too dangerous to be there, right, for Western journalists. And this is one of the things that's changed about the modern era. Then My Lai, you know, I think My Lai is one of those many things that makes the war seem less like a noble cause, and so it's part of this snowballing process. But you certainly, I mean, by that time most people were already against the war, and you don't see any bends in the curve there. And if you look closely at public opinion and at news coverage, there was a lot of defensiveness and denial about My Lai, right? And there's a wonderful article somebody wrote around the time, a sociologist, called "It Never Happened, and Besides They Deserved It." It's about opinion about My Lai. And if you look at the news coverage, you know, there was some powerful coverage, but an awful lot of it is about the kind of legal maneuvering and so on. And I mean, a lot of the horror of what actually happened kind of disappears from that coverage. By the way, as far as the recurrence of Vietnam and Iraq, one of the interesting parallels is it was the very same journalist who broke the Abu Ghraib story as broke My Lai, right? An independent journalist, not part of the mainstream news media, Seymour Hersh, who broke both of those stories. It was very hard for either of those stories to get into the mainstream media. And in the case of Abu Ghraib, it never would have gotten in the news without those pictures, I really think.
How about one more question?
Okay. Yeah.
Speaking of pictures, 1963, Malcolm Brown, AP reporter, took a picture of a Buddhist monk burning himself up in protest to the South Vietnamese government. Probably the first time people in America saw a picture from Vietnam in newspapers. How else did the still photographs that came out of Vietnam affect public opinion and the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think nobody knows exactly how still photographs affected public opinion. They were important. I mean, they were an important part of the coverage. They circulated a lot. A lot of the most important images, a lot of the dramatic images that people remember were simultaneously television and still photographs and circulated that way. So there's also the picture of General Le Wan executing a prisoner during the Tet Offensive. That was also taken by a still photographer and by NBC News. And the picture of the girl who was hit by napalm in 1972, a similar kind of a story. It's also, of course, true about still photos, maybe more than anything else, is that you can interpret them in different ways, right? So, like the image of General Le Wan, I think that's one of those ones that, at the time, you had very polarized interpretations of it, right? So that there were some people who said, yeah, this shows what a brutal war this is. And there were other people who said, well, he was a terrorist, you know, we don't have any sympathy.
The backstory didn't come out about him executing his family and all that, you know.
Yeah, I think it did later, but nobody knew it at the time.
Right, at the time, nobody knew that.
But I think that there was, I mean, the sort of general image of the Viet Cong at the time was that these are terrorists, and you know, so people don't. It's like Saddam Hussein is being killed, right? We don't have any sympathy for that. So, and people are polarized on that at the time. So, you know, I think that the still photos are like all of the rest of this stuff. They're a part of that. They're a part of that process of change. One of the most important things is when Life magazine, this is one of the symbols of change. I guess in late '67, Life magazine made this decision to put still photographs of all the Americans killed in the war that week on its cover. That, I think, is in some ways more dramatic than any of those other still photography episodes, because it's putting an emphasis on the casualties. And I would bet that if there was a way to measure impact on public opinion, that had more than, than those other photographs.
Well, we could probably spend the whole evening discussing this fascinating topic and more from Dr. Hallin's research, but let's thank him again for... And then again, just a reminder to please join us next Monday at 6 p.m. here in LAV 101 for General Buford Blunt, who will talk about his experience with Ted Koppel being embedded with him and the 3rd Infantry Division in Iraq in 2003. So thank you all for coming out. We really appreciate it.